was kind of really when I first decided to kind of go for it and start the company, was an article written by Jim Collins called, it was in Fast Company, and what he talked about was the difference between failure and Fallure. And just last week I was over at the a local rock climbing rock climbing gym, Climb So Ill, actually saw Stevie there, and it reminded me of this article and wanted to kind of bring some of the lessons of that back into kind of more up to date to where we're at now. And so, in rock climbing, you've got, if that's your rock, you've got different approaches, different angles, different handle holds that you can attack, different approaches that you can make. If it's out in the real world in rocks, then you've got different approaches with different cracks and different ledges and things like that to take. So when you're at the bottom, you're typically going to look at it and try to take your approach and try to figure out how you're going to attack the rock. And so you start kind of going up. If your goal is to get to kind of this place right here, you're going to look at it and say, okay, I'm going to go from here to here to here. And then, so at some point, you're going to look and see, say if this point's here, you've got this point now, you've got to make this leap. And it's a really tough one to take. And so you've got to figure out if it's really going to attack it and go for it, or if you're either going to go an easier route, or if you're kind of tied up that you can just come down off the rock. And so really this point right here is one that you've really got to decide if you're going to go for it or not. And a lot of times this can come down to either failure or Fallure. And either way, when you go after this and say you don't make it, you end up down here. But there's a difference on failure or Fallure from the standpoint of if you let go or if you fall. Subtle difference, but it's pretty dramatic in the way that it's different kind of mentally. Because if you go for it here and you don't make it, and you go for the hold and it doesn't hold, but then you fall, you went for it. Whereas if you just let go, you kind of gave up. And so if you think about it from this perspective, we've talked about the perseverance curve. You get to this point where it's the breaking point or the tipping point. You have that same thing right here, is you have a choice. Are you going to give up, or are you going to go for it? And this is where you really have to separate. There's a difference between, failure or Fallure, letting go or falling. And when you've got to decide when sometimes it's good to let go and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's good to fall and sometimes it's not. Is you got to separate consequences from the probability. So what that means here is, in this instance, if you go for it and you miss it, you've got ropes, you've got the harnesses. So what's going to happen is you're going to come slowly down. Or, at the gym, there's a big padded floor. So really, the consequences of you falling aren't that bad. It's not that big of a deal. Whereas, maybe the probability, maybe this is a really hard climb. Maybe this is a really hard jump. Maybe the probability of you actually hitting it are really low. Maybe it's only a 20% chance. Maybe it's only a 10% chance. But at that instance, when the consequences really aren't that bad, why not go for it? Because worst case scenario isn't that bad. And so what you have when you have that scenario kind of play out in lots of different areas is, even in, some of you guys lift weights, and so there's when you're bench pressing, you're also, there's a difference on consequences versus probability. So how do you really want to focus on now reducing the consequences while increasing your probability of success, right? And so when you're lifting weights, when you're bench pressing, what do you do to reduce the consequences to make sure that something bad really doesn't happen?
Color the weights.
So you put a collar on the weights, make sure that they don't fall off, and do one of these numbers. What else do you do?
Get a spot.
You get a spotter, right? So you have somebody there that's, if you can't get it up, then they're there to lift it off your neck to make sure you don't die. You know, and so there's the same phenomenon in business. And so in this instance, when the consequences are now lower, now, you know, if you've got a, you know, kind of a risk-reward scale, you know, typically people look at risk and reward being two sides of the same coin. Higher risk, higher reward. But what have you done here?
It's like your cushion.
You've lowered the risk, right? So now you can take this approach to where you separate those two, that your reward stays high, but you've lowered the risk. So if you've got collars on the weights, you've lowered your risk a little bit. Then if you get a spotter, you've lowered your risk a little bit. And you keep forcing the risk line further and further down while keeping the reward at the same height. What this allows you to do then is take more chances. Because if worst case scenario, you know, if it's from here to here, if worst case scenario is this, and it's survivable, and you're going, if you let it go to Fallure, or if you go to Fallure and you fall down here, this is your worst case scenario, but this is your potential upside, that's a little more willing to take on. So if you're lifting, you can push yourself a little bit more. You can do 1 extra set, 2 extra reps, 3 extra reps, put on a little more weight. And over time, you know, by pushing yourself, you're going to stretch yourself, and you're going to push this line further up and further out. And so you're going to be able to push yourself further and further and further in ways that you didn't know that you could. And so really what it comes down here with when it comes to, you know, so say you're working on a project or an initiative. How do you guys see this playing out in something that you're doing within business?
Small batch.
So doing small batch. How else? What are other ways that you can reduce push down that risk line? So minimum viable products, right? So when you have this line here, and then you can push down your risk lines on projects by iterating very, very slowly and having very little work in progress between what you're working on. And then also, as you reduce the small batch, you're just iterating. You know, we've talked about idea vortex. So you're iterating little bitty pieces that if this doesn't work, then all you got to do is kind of adjust to here. So you can, the real consequence isn't that high. And really what it comes down to then is if you let go or versus where you fall, it is full effort. You know, we've all done things that we haven't given our full effort to, that we haven't fully committed to, that we haven't really just kind of, you know, as they say, burn the ships as you land and there's no turning back. But when you put in full effort, then there's no excuses. And so that's a lot of times what ends up happening is, well, I could have done that, but, you know, this came up. Or, you know, if I would have just given it a little more, I could have done it. And this is kind of the no excuses standpoint. Because what we're after is you know, failure is scary, right? You know, no one likes to fail. But failure is about dangerous. So if you can reduce your danger, then all you're really afraid of is the act of failure, because really the consequences are what are dangerous. Failing is just kind of in our own mental approach to things. So if we can really separate these things out, we can separate the consequences from the probability, then we can push ourselves a little bit further and make sure that and this will be another one that we talk about next week, on approach versus outcomes. is another way that you can separate it out, and we'll talk about that more next week. But when you can separate these two things out, then you can push yourself a little bit further, because the act of falling, of failure, as long as you're mitigating your risk and as long as you've separated these out, isn't a big deal. That's just part of the learning curve, and that's because you've done the work to prepare and to protect yourself against bad things from happening. It's when you keep your line unseparated and you push yourself a little bit further and a little further, and you get up further on the cliff, that's when it gets dangerous. So that's if you're climbing a wall without any harnesses, without any ropes. That's dangerous. Making this big leap while you're fully harnessed, scary, but you can go for it because it's not dangerous. And so when you're working on projects, make sure you push yourself to failure by preparing yourself by mitigating those risks. Because, in our environment, you're not going to get, which are we going to get mad about? It's not going to be this one. It's when you just give up, when you don't give full effort, when you let go. If you have the right intentions and you've done the right homework and you've done and put in the right effort, all you've done is learn what not to do. And so now you get back from this spot, go back to here, and then you try it again because you're that much smarter and you're that much more wise. Where else have you guys seen this played out? Or does this make sense? Do you guys see how this plays out kind of in everyday life as well as in rock climbing?
I think that we can all increase our probability of success too just through learning. Like with rock climbing, you start with lower measured routes so that you work your way up to the harder ones. And I think it's just experience. So as we learn more or do things more and more times, our probability of success goes up.
Absolutely. So if the first time you climb this rock, it's scary, right? You're scared about it. But as long as you're roped in, you're gonna, even if you fall, you're gonna live to see another day, and you get to take another crack at it. And the more time you do it, the more things you're gonna learn, the easier it's going to be, and then you can tackle another rock that's similar, but has similar challenges, maybe from this to this point, or even from this point to this point, the one that was really scary before and you couldn't do. Now that same move is right here. You can learn from that move and apply it. That's experience, that's wisdom. So, but if you don't take this effort to mitigate risk and mitigate the dangers, and you fall and you die, metaphorically speaking, or in rock climbing in reality, if you're out in the wild, you can't learn from that experience. If you're out of business, you can't iterate. If you do something really risky and cost your job, you can't learn from that, at least in that role. You can learn it into your next role. So that's a really good point of, this is about education and learning and mitigating that risk so you can continue to learn. And the further you can push this line down, the further you can go up on this line, and you can try and go from here to here. Might not work, but hey, maybe one time it will. Maybe there's a 1% chance that it would work. And if there's zero danger, why not try it? Because every once in a while, that when you swing for the fences, every once in a while, that 1% actually hits.
I think that really a lot of everything that Ben and Andrew and I went over on Development Day falls directly into this, because a lot of what we talked about is taking away a lot of the risks so that our reward is greater, and processes and things we want to put into it so that we're not building projects and then getting stuck somewhere and finding that we're losing revenue profitability because of it. So a lot of what we talked about is how to make our jobs easier every time we go forward and put these processes in place so that we benefit more from the end every day.
Yeah, so what you're focusing on is each iteration that you go through, moving this line a little bit lower and a little bit lower. And then as this line goes lower, with, you know, and this is where we talked about same amount of time, less or more value, less time, higher value, or both, is when you reduce, it's the same thing as reward and risk. When you can reduce reward, you can keep risk the same, or you can go higher and keep it the same, and it's really that balancing act.
Yeah. And actually, Bob and I did a project this week where we utilized one of the elements that we talked about, and yeah, we're going to get some profit out of it because of that, more than we have on other products that are the same. So.
Cool. Ben, do you have some?
Does this correlate with the pyramid that we use to like build our systems, like the wider it is, and like, because everything's always seemed to be going on these angles. We talk about keeping a wide base of like foundation and then building up from that.
Yeah.
And then so that way, if we do try to overextend, we might only fall like one level down instead of all the way to the bottom.
Absolutely. And so, you know, that's where you're talking about the kind of the Webrian theorem one we talked about, is where as we grow, we want to grow kind of this way and up, and continue to grow our base out, and then connect it up here. And you're absolutely right, is when we're kind of building these blocks, we're building in our safety nets, we're building in our cushions, that we're reducing the risk by small batching everything we do, and kind of building on top of each other. So we're not getting overextended, we're not reaching too far that our safety harness and our safety equipment isn't going to protect us from. So really what this boils down to is, you know, like we've talked about, is the safer you can make the risk-reward equation, the further you can push yourself. And the further you can push yourself, the scarier it's going to get, but also the safer it is. And so what it boils down to is, if you can separate failure from failure, scary from dangerous, consequences from probability, you're going to be able to push yourself further, because now you can separate your approach versus the outcome. And that's really what this is about, is how can you push yourself? How can you make yourself grow each and every day by challenging yourself and pushing yourself to make a little bit harder pull, to make a little bit harder jump. And that's what these will allow you to do, is not beat yourself up when you fall, but instead to celebrate it, because you push yourself all the way to your breaking point, to where you came off, and now you can go once again and try it again with that experience, with that wisdom, and, you know, hopefully this time lengthen the move. So that is the difference between failure and failure. Thank you, Mr. Collins. So.